Marc Freedman is CEO and president of Encore.org, an organization he founded in 1998. Freedman is a member of the experts group of the Wall Street Journal, a frequent commentator in the national media, and author of several books, including Encore, Finding Work That Matters and the Second Half of Life, The Big Shift, Navigating the New Stage Beyond Midlife, The Kindness of Strangers, Adult Mentors, Urban Youth, and the New Volunteerism. He'll be in conversation tonight with Eric Liu. Eric is the founder and CEO of Citizen University and the executive director of the Aspen Institute Citizenship and American Identity program. Eric previously served as a White House speechwriter and policy advisor for President Bill Clinton. He's a regular columnist on CNN.com and a correspondent for The Atlantic. They're here tonight to discuss Marc's new book, How to Live Forever, The Enduring Power of Connecting the Generations. Please join me in giving a warm town hall welcome to Marc Freedman and Eric Liu.
Thank you, Edward. Thanks, everybody, for being here tonight. This is a wonderful full house in a wonderful neighborhood, and we're so glad to get to spend some time with you tonight. I wanted actually to begin by adding some other special thanks for this evening and their partnership in this gathering to AARP Washington, Parent Map Magazine, 501 Commons, the Jesuit Volunteer JV Encore Program, the University of Washington's Retiree Association, and Friends of the Children for their support of this event and their partnership with Town Hall and Encore. You'll hear more about Encore and their Gen to Gen campaign, but I want to identify now, if you're interested in getting involved with Encore.org and their Gen to Gen campaign locally, please afterwards approach our friend Jim McGinley after the event, and I'll ask him to raise his right arm because his left arm is in a sling right now. Where is he? There he is. He's back, right back there. And we'll say hi to Jim later on. But thanks to all those organizations, and thanks to all of you for coming here this evening. So this book is marks such a great distillation of a life you have lived in public service. It is not just a distillation of your worldview or of the work you're doing right now, but a whole weave of philosophies here. And for some of you who have no idea what it is we're going to talk about, but we're just drawn by the title, How to Live Forever, I'll say at the outset that the answer is not skin cream. The answer is not fad diets, but the answer is, Marc?
Is living on through the next generation. And I have to start out with my confession. This book in many ways chronicles a conversation that the two of us have been having for quite some time, since I was young and had no gray hair. But it also is adorned with this title, How to Live Forever, which Eric instructed me to use as the title of the book. I had some boring, bland, utterly forgettable title, and we were sitting in a coffee house, and he said, "You should call the book How to Live Forever." And since I do everything that Eric tells me to do, and it always works out, I did.
I will take full credit and 10% of your royalties.
Well, you'll be able to go right over to the Red Mill Burgers and get the special with that.
I'm glad you already know Red Mill here. That's pretty good. Let's back up a step before we even unpack the title and the spirit of this book. Encore.org, the organization that you founded and lead right now, has been working for many years now to popularize this idea of an encore career, a second act for the greater good, as you have put it at different times. And I'm curious in the first place, just if you would describe for folks the nature of the work that you all are doing at Encore right now, and why it is that you felt in the first place that it was necessary to reframe this phase, this half of life, in these terms oriented toward the greater good.
Well, part of it is driven by the growing length of life. We, mostly have a conception of the life course that was designed for a bygone era when people lived to 60 or 70. And more and more years have been accumulating. In fact, half the children born since 2000 in the developed world are expected to see their 100th birthday. So we have to really rethink the shape of life. But there's a science fiction writer, William Gibson, who has a wonderful phrase. He says, "The future's already here, it's just unevenly distributed." And it's true that many people have been already living out a very rich period. Think of Jimmy Carter, who is now, has overcome brain cancer and is continuing to do remarkable work. But what we found at Encore is that there are so many people who aren't Bill Gates and Jimmy Carter, ordinary people who are already doing the same thing. We did a study about 5 years ago that showed that 4.5 million people were already in Encore careers, second acts focused on the greater good, that might not be as long as their midlife work, but that were as significant, that weighed as much, and that 21 million more people wanted to move in the same direction, but they were struggling with how to get from what's last to what's next. And so a lot of our work at Encore has been not only highlighting these exemplars of an Encore career, but also trying to build pathways to purpose in the second half of life. We have a program that's essentially an internship for grown-ups called the Encore Fellows Program. There are a couple thousand Encore Fellows around the country, including some here in Seattle. And it's basically a gap year for grown-ups. It's a chance to spend a year working in a social change organization half-time and figure out if this pathway is something for you. And then there's also been a tremendous growth in higher education programs that are helping people go back to school and prepare for doing significant work in this stage of life. And so I think what we're starting to see is examples of a lot of the same kind of pathways that young people use to move from adolescence to adulthood, but into this new period of life that doesn't yet have a name, but amounts to a really extraordinary opportunity to continue to contribute.
I want to name a part that's implicit in what you said, but it's, you know me, I like to actually sharpen this, to bring it to the surface, that there's a bit of implied edge to the purpose of this work, which is that our society, our market-driven society tells narratives about what this phase of life is supposed to be and what the, quote, good life is supposed to be in what has been called retirement. And part of what you're doing is, in a sense, countercultural. You are pushing back against that dominant narrative of you got yours, hold on to yours, indulge in yours, kind of, take care of yourself and, relax, enjoy. And you're pushing back against that narrative by offering these positive exemplars of people who are doing things for the greater good, but also challenging the idea of retirement itself, right? And the idea of this phase of life as something that ought to be so wholly focused in a more self-indulgent way. Is that fair to say?
It is. I think we took a wrong turn in the middle of the last century, and it was understandable at that juncture. In 1935, we created Social Security, which was one of the great achievements of public policy in the history of the country, but we adopted the age of 65 as the eligibility age for Social Security, but really the definition of old age, and it was based on a 19th century idea. That was the eligibility age for the Prussian military pension that Otto von Bismarck had implemented in the 1880s, convinced that the state would never pay out a pension. He was 78 at the time, but he thought nobody else would ever get to that point. And it's probably significant that the very first person to get a Social Security check in this country, a retired bookkeeper in Ludlow, Vermont, named Ida Mae Fuller, proceeded to live to 100. She paid $20.75 into the system, and she got $22,888.92. I always feel like I have to add those last two decimal places since she was, in fact, a bookkeeper. But there's an economist at Stanford, a guy named John Chauvin, who says we'd never use $1935 in 2018 without adjusting them for inflation, but we use this definition of being over the hill as if it was some eternal verity. But things have changed, and and they're continuing to change. But what happened in mid-century is that people started living longer even by the 1950s. In fact, Walter Reuther, the great labor leader, the head of the UAW, got up in front of his union in 1948 and described retirees as too old to work, too young to die. Essentially, it's living in this limbo land, a rejected group in society, and a group of entrepreneurs came in, including Del Webb, the owner of your beloved Yankees from 1946 to 1965. Webb coined the phrase the golden years, and he built the first large-scale age-segregated retirement community in America, Sun City, which opened on January 1st, 1960, where people could retreat from being too old to work, too young to die, and pretend in a society obsessed with youth that they were young again. And the secret to that community was because everybody was old, nobody was old. You could be a kid again. And it was really the fusion of age segregation and what Betty Friedan called the youth short circuit that has, I think, defined so much of how we've organized later life in this country for the past 50 years, but that isn't going to serve us well going forward.
So I think this is a really important point to stay with, because when we talk about how to live forever, and your answer is to be of service to a rising generation, to younger people, and to pass on values, knowledge, skill, experience, culture, whatever it may be, that is the path to immortality, that rather than trying to maximize the number of years to be in one of those age-segregated settings. Key to that storyline, though, is this the past fact of segregation, age segregation, and your call now for integration, right? And so a lot of what, you talk in this book about the, not even today, but the kind of, as a matter of evolutionary biology, the importance of grandmothers to human civilization, right? And the critical role that grandmothers have played, and why from a purely, I mean, this is the question only a scientist would ask, like, from an evolutionary biological standpoint, what are grandmothers for, right? I mean, this is the way scientists would say it, like they can't reproduce anymore. Why are they still here, right? And the answer is, in part, to tell us about that answer and how that answer actually brings us to this, reminds us about the centrality of integrating ages and not segregating and separating people by age.
Yeah, it's interesting. I started out, your question raises that I started out writing this book that was supposed to be a critique of all these Silicon Valley narcissists who want to live forever because they have billions of dollars and it takes a long time to spend that much money. So they've been spending, in fact, now there's, I think, last estimate, $45 billion a year that are going into radical life extension. And it's not just, another 5 years that they're talking about. Larry Ellison, the founder of Oracle, had commented in the media that he never thought much of death. And so he was going to invest in conquering it, to which Michael Kinsley, the writer and former editor of Slate, said, well, you know what, it really doesn't matter so much what Larry Ellison thinks of death as it does what death thinks of Larry Ellison. And so I wanted to attack this whole idea of, instead of investing in rising generation and future generations, actually trying to be those generations literally, and so much that was wrong with that. But in the course of trying to write that book, a different one emerged, and it is a story of how we lost that fundamental generative instinct to invest in younger generations. That goes back to as you were saying, the beginning of human history, and evolutionary anthropologists did wonder for many years why women live beyond reproductive age, because in the harsh world of the selfish gene, that didn't make any sense. And a woman, an anthropologist named Kristen Hawk at the University of Utah, tried to understand that dilemma, and she studied hunter-gatherer tribes in Latin America, in Tanzania, and found that it was the role that grandmothers play in taking care of young children that enable both parents to go out and hunt and gather, and that was critical to the long gestational period that separates human babies from all other species. So basically, it's grandmothers that made us human. And even if you go and read the Bible, Moses doesn't go to the promised land. He lives to 120 without any help from Larry Ellison or the Google founders. But he becomes Moses the teacher in these latter stages. And there's a Greek proverb that says, society grows great when older people plant trees under whose shade they shall never sit. So this is deeply bred in human history, but I think what I discovered in the research for this book is it's not just evolution and history and religious and cultural tradition, but it's actually human development, that the needs and assets of the generations fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. And so that was really eye-opening to me, because amidst all the hand-wringing about the new makeup of society, it turns out that this may be one of the best things ever to happen to us.
You write in the book about models of other communities and societies outside our now-focused, market-obsessed society here in the United States. Places like Singapore that are that have an underlying culture of that kind of generational integration, but also are thinking from a public policy and a nonprofit standpoint, how do we accelerate that? How do we thicken that ecosystem of cross-generational living and learning? What is going on in Singapore that we could learn from, if not in the whole United States, at least in Seattle, right?
Yes.
Seattle, we've got a pretty good culture here. We've got a pretty good raw material for this kind of intergenerational transfer. What could Seattle learn from Singapore in how they're going about doing this?
Well, it's interesting because Singapore's learned a lot from Seattle. That was one of the surprises. I went to Singapore because they have a $3 billion Singaporean dollars, which is roughly 2.1 million US dollars, planned to become a kampong for all ages. And kampong is the Malay word for village, that focused on intergenerational harmony. And as you say, there's a deep tradition in Singapore of the generations coming together, but that as the society's become more mobile, it's been lost. And so more Western. And so they've mounted an all-out effort to reweave the generations, and they looked around the world for models of how that could be done. And one of the places they came was here to the Providence, Mount St. Vincent intergenerational childcare program that's the subject of a beautiful documentary called The Growing Season. And it's a very simple but powerful idea of bringing two age-segregated institutions, a preschool and an early childhood setting, together with a setting that's been exclusively focused on older people. And so I was so impressed with the amount of money Singapore was putting into this, the fact that there was a society-wide commitment to bringing the generations together. They've mandated that every new senior center and preschool have to be co-located. They've brought the best architects together to create multi-generational flats where people can live together. I went to a church that wasn't even part of the government plan, but where they were under a mandate in a society where land is scarce to intensify the value of the land. And so they were building a nursing home there, and they built a 200 child preschool that's going to be interwoven and a playground. And so they've really thought of everything and put money behind it. But what struck me is how many of the ideas actually were things that were happening here in the United States, where we have a kind of ferment going on. I went to Cleveland to see another example of this. One of my favorite encounters in the book, a place called Judson Manor, a senior living facility near Case Western University in the Cleveland Clinic, where somebody came up with the great idea a few years ago to provide free housing for graduate students at the Cleveland Institute of Music in return for playing concerts at the facility. And what started out with this relatively limited idea ultimately blossomed into all kinds of very powerful relationships. I met this couple who, of a young violist from the Institute of Music who married another violist, and they had their 90-year-old neighbor be the maid of honor at their wedding. And this is what happens when people live in proximity. And when I showed up at Cleveland in November, who was there to join me but 30 Swedish social scientists who were coming to Cleveland when the Scandinavians are coming to Cleveland for ideas around social progress. You know something is going right. But I feel like a lot of these efforts, and I know I'm going on and on, but they're really kind of an undoing project because Zarek and I, have talked about before, 100 years ago at the beginning of the 20th century, we were the most age-integrated society in the world. We worked together on the farmstead, people of all ages. We lived in multi-generational households, even in one-room schoolhouses. There were students in their 30s and 40s. We were completely inured to the idea of chronological age. Knowing somebody's age in 19th century America would be equivalent to knowing, the person next to you's blood type today. You'd never even think to ask. The birthday song wasn't invented until 1934. We didn't even celebrate birthdays in the 19th century. Now, any self-respecting journalist, Eric Liu, 32, said, exactly. So, and then we over the course of one century, completely reorganized society so that to a kind of age apartheid, where people of different generations, unless you're lucky enough to live in Judson Manor or at the Mount here in Seattle, rarely encounter each other in daily life. And so I feel like one of the challenges that Singapore is tackling is to undo that reorganization and get back to something that fits more with what we know about human development.
So that century you've described of going in this direction in the United States is the result of some combination of market forces, public policy choices that accentuated or accelerated those trends, and just culture in general. So in the undoing project here in the United States, over what I hope will be less than the next century, is it the same mix of things? Do you put particular emphasis? Are you counting on government to be the thicker leg of the stool? Do you think it's actually going to be citizens like us just taking ideas and examples like this as our own charge in our own neighborhoods and with institutions that are nearby with us? What is the role of market institutions in this? So, when you think about the undoing, paint the big picture for us, and then I want to get down to a couple of specific things too.
Yeah, and I think what happened in the last century, a lot of it happened for the best of reasons. Child labor laws, Social Security, universal high school. But the end result of a lot of these decisions that started out with almost a kind of industrial sense of efficiency, and also in some cases a real sense of social progress, they did contribute to this lockstep life course where we push all the education in the front of life, all the work in the middle, and all the leisure at the end, and then we set up a group of institutions that are organized to support that, but we miss the larger truth, which is that when you reorganize society like that, you end up, you get some efficiencies, but you lose a sense of the wholeness of life. And I think it's a grievous wound that we've inflicted upon ourselves, and it's probably no surprise that at the end of that, we live in a society where people are worried about conflict between the generations, kids versus canes. There's a sense that we're going to be, that there's a sense of scarcity. Older people and younger people are going to have their needs met separately. And that we have an epidemic of loneliness. The former Surgeon General Vivek Murthy has written in Harvard Business Review that loneliness is the most significant public health problem in America today, equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And the two groups that are the most lonely are young people and older people. So it's a kind of a harvest of pain that has resulted in this, and yet it's it's so counter, as I was saying earlier, to what studies of human happiness have shown. And so, I know this isn't answering your question, but I wanted to say this because when Eric and I first started having our conversation, it was about mentoring and young people. And one of the most significant findings about young people who made it against the odds is that they had a caring adult who played a significant role in their life. In fact, Yuri Bronfenbrenner, one of the giants of child development, the co-founder of the Head Start program, when he was asked at the end of his career, could he sum up everything that he'd learned over these decades of academic research, he said, what every child needs is at least one adult who's irrationally crazy about them. And now we know from research on later life that the secret to happiness is being irrationally crazy about young people. Older people who mentor young people are 3 times as likely to be happy as those who fail to do so. So how is it that we, could have messed things up so badly? And as you were saying, how can we undo that? What role could government play? What role can culture play? What role can we play in our communities and in our own lives?
That's what I'm asking you.
Well, since you gave me the title of the book, I thought you could answer that question too.
Oh, well, I think, from our work at Citizen University, we put citizens, every day in their everyday civic lives quite at the center of that. But you have this bird's eye view looking at the role of public policy, whether in Singapore or other places. And I'm wondering whether you feel like, what's your theory of change for how we are going to, over the course of the next couple generations, unwind some of this harvest of pain?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we need public policy, although we're certainly not on the brink of anything that's anywhere near what's needed. But
you suggested something. I mean, forget about national politics for a minute. But even in the city of Seattle, right? You've just suggested something in talking about Singapore that if it were baked into zoning requirements that there be age integration in the creation of certain facilities, that that the design of density would take into account age diversity as well as other forms, right? Are there, even at the local level, things that we could be pushing our city officials for to get more of this get the flywheel turning on this just in our own town?
It's a good analogy because Singapore has 4 million people. It's the size of Chicago. So thinking about it in a city context makes a lot of sense. I think even if we just started as citizens, as our individuals, and just thought about our own happiness, I think we need to ask this question about, are we living in an age bubble? Are we segregating ourselves, cutting ourselves off from other generations? Because it's inimical, despite so much what we've been told, to our own happiness. I mean, biology does flow downhill. The real fountain of youth is not coming from a test tube at Google. It's the fountain with youth. It's through these connections with young people. So from our own self-interest, I think, we need to stop trying so hard to be young and rather be there, be proximate with young people. And so I think there's a lot we can do when we start asking those questions, and how we volunteer, in where we live. But then I think as a society, there's so much more that we need to do. I was struck, one of the other examples I saw globally after I went to Singapore was in the UK, where a woman named Lucy Calloway, who's one of the most beloved columnists at the Financial Times and has a following of millions of people across the globe, had a daughter who went into the British equivalent of Teach for America, Teach First. And she was so impressed with her daughter's experience that she decided to flip that old adage and follow in her daughter's footsteps. And she announced 2 years ago at the age of 57 that a year from November of 2016 that she was no longer going to be writing columns, but that she was going to be in front of a London classroom teaching math. And then she took the next step, which Jimmy Carter hasn't done, which Bill Gates hasn't done, which no exemplar of this kind of encore ideal that I know of has done in the United States. And she challenged her readers of a certain age to quit their jobs and to follow her. And they had lined up 20 positions. She'd created a new organization called Now Teach. She was going to call it Teach Last, as in contrast to Teach First, but people advised her that that was a little too gloomy. So she changed it to Now Teach, and 1,000 people showed up, quit their jobs to join Now Teach. And so she had this dilemma. There were 50 applicants for every slot, and they partly solved the dilemma. They increased it to 47 slots the first year, and now they're expanding widely. But she asked. She was a Pied Piper. So here we don't have the grand plan, the American equivalent of the Singaporean compound for all ages, but we don't even have the Pied Piper. But we do have this ferment. We've got all this social innovation going on, and then we have our own lives. And there's so much, I think, that we can do to start remedying this problem that's right in front of us.
One of the people who figures prominently in this book and in your life is a man named John Gardner, who many of you know of from a lifetime of service and leadership, and former cabinet secretary, creator of Common Cause, leader of many different civic organizations, and author. Describe that relationship, because you were pretty young when you first came to know him and first came to cook up ideas with him, and just describe that relationship of mentoring and how it has shaped your whole worldview and approach to making change.
In the book, I told a very uncomfortable story about when I was first getting to know John, who was the founding board member of Encore.org. And as Eric was saying, he's a man who won the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1964. That's, the ultimate gold watch. And I went and looked at the other people who won the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1964, and it was Tom Watson, the founder of IBM, Carl Sandburg, the poet, T.S. Eliot. You just go on and on and on. And these absolute, A. Philip Randolph, who was a great civil rights pioneer. And John did all of his best work after winning the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He was in his late 50s then. He went on. He was Lyndon Johnson's Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, and one of the real architects of the Great Society and the war on poverty. In fact, one of his most resonant quotes was during the battles over Medicare. He's the person who implemented Medicare. He said, "America today faces breathtaking opportunities disguised as unsolvable problems." And that could be a Citizens University watchword every bit as much as Encore.org. But John took me under wing when he was in his 80s, and we became very close. And I was so interested in his life, and I was always peppering him with questions about his time in the Lyndon Johnson administration. In fact, it was such a different time that when Johnson was taking him out to announce him as Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, they were just about to get to the podium, and he said, "You are a Democrat, aren't you?" And John was, he was actually a Republican. He was a liberal Republican in the Nelson Rockefeller vein, and he said, "I'm a man who loves his country." But they were too close to the podium for him to turn back. But that'll give you a sense of how things were different in that period. But when John took me to meet the benefactor who funded the creation of Encore.org all these years ago, and afterwards I was asking him more about his life, and he was putting up, because he always wanted to talk about the future, even though it's the future that he wouldn't see. He didn't want to harp on the past. But I asked him what he thought his greatest achievement was, and I was so absorbed in the conversation I neglected to notice this accumulation of red taillights in front of us on the freeway. We were traveling south on Highway 101, and I slammed on the brakes, and I was in a Volkswagen Beetle, and John was shoehorned into the passenger seat, and he had his hands planted on the dashboard, and he was repeating the phrase, "Oh my God," over and over again. And I was repeating the phrase, "I'm killing a national treasure." He literally never drove with me again after that evening. But I think the only thing that saved us is, that whole, thing where your life's supposed to flash before your eyes before when you're at that final moment. But he had such a rich life, we got a little extra time and the car was able to stop. But one of the things that I have been thinking about, John, is when he was, he founded Common Cause, the first campaign finance reform organization, and at the 20th anniversary of Common Cause, he was already in his 70s, and he was reflecting on later life, and he told the story of a recent call he'd gotten from his 100-year-old mother, who was telling him that she said, "Johnny, this whole aging thing has really got me down." And he said, "But Mother, you've got all your faculties, you can walk, you've got children who love you." She said, no, I'm not talking about myself, it's you and your brother that I'm worried about. But in that speech, he talked about how he was more conscious than ever of the passage of time. And I was reading your beautiful sermon from Civic Saturday this week in which you talked about time, and I think that when you boil all of these issues down, I think that there's this very powerful notion of time that you start feeling. I'm 60 now, that I feel. You realize the road doesn't go on forever, and it makes the time more meaningful, and it does force you to think about the time beyond our lives.
One of the things, Mark, that you alluded to earlier, which is, actually, you've used a word several times, and you've used another word not at all. The word you've used several times is purpose. You've talked about purposeful life and making these years, later years, full of purpose. A word that's often thrown around in conversations like this that you haven't used is legacy. And I think that's very interesting, right? Because legacy has a legacy of baggage in some ways, and purpose is still forward-looking and animated. And you created something at Encore called the Purpose Prize, which many years ago, now actually run by AARP, initially to identify people in their Encore careers, at the time over age 60, and now I think at a lower age,
50,
over
yes.
50, who are doing remarkable work for the greater good, and every year selecting some handful of them to get prizes between $25,000 and $100,000. And this Purpose Prize has been one of your tools. You've been very modest here. I mean, this is a one-man theory of change here. I mean, he's been pushing public policy, he's been activating citizens as a Pied Piper, but also, using culture and things like a Purpose Prize and getting celebrities and others in mass-scale organizations like AARP to sign on to the Purpose Prize so that you popularize an ideal and you give people something affirmative to drive toward, not a wag of the finger, you ought to be doing more of this, right? And talk a bit more about, if I'm reading it right, kind of the benefits of the affirmative language of purpose, and maybe the more backward-looking language of legacy, and why and when you use each.
There's so many really compelling ideas in what you were just saying. And what was so interesting about the Purpose Prize, so this was a prize for social innovators, like Eric was saying, over the age of 60. And it was forged at a time when there was much celebration of social innovation by young people, creating things like Teach for America, which have been spectacularly valuable, but we were aware through our own work that there were a lot of people who were on the other side of midlife who were also doing some of their best work, and this prize was designed to show that innovation and experience could go hand in hand, and we raised a bunch of money to provide this award, which we described as the opposite of a Lifetime Achievement Award, an investment in what somebody 60 or 70 or beyond was going to do next. In fact, one of our winners was somebody who was 94, who had started his innovation, which was called Opening Minds to the Arts in Tucson, which was based on Howard Gardner's theories of multiple intelligence and providing arts and creativity education to students in Tucson. So it was really showing that that this period, which so often is seen as the leftover years, could actually be some of the most fertile time. But then as the deadline drew the first year, we got very nervous. We were going to give out 5 prizes. Will we even have enough applicants to give out all 5 prizes. In fact, that we were betting a pizza on the actual number. I bet that we would have 100. We already had 170 nominations at the time that I bet 100, which will give you a sense of how optimistic a person I am. But we got 1,200 nominations the first year for the 5 prizes. And over the 10 years we ran the Purpose Prize, there were 10,000 nominations, which will give you an idea. And what was so striking is that most of the people who won the Purpose Prize or who were finalists, nominees, were they were doing new work, but they were also drawing heavily on their experience. And it was this blend. They weren't reinventing themselves really so much as they were weaving together what they had learned from life with tackling a problem right in front of them. One of my favorite examples is a guy named Gary Maxworthy in San Francisco who had wanted to go into the Peace Corps. He heard JFK's call to ask what you could do for your country, but he already had started a family, so he deferred that dream, worked for 40 years. His wife died of cancer, and he became more conscious than ever of the passage of time and decided he was going to try to do something significant. He already had grandchildren. He didn't want to go abroad, so he joined Vista. And he had spent his midlife career in the food distribution business, and Vista sent him to the food bank in San Francisco, where he realized they were only distributing processed and canned foods. And so he knew from all of his years in the food distribution business that growers throughout the state were throwing out fresh produce that was blemished, not seen as restaurant quality, but good and nutritious in every other way. And so he put 2 and 2 together and created the Farm to Family program, which last year distributed 140 million pounds of produce in California. And it was just, as a Peace Corps volunteer, he could have taught English and done much good work. But here was somebody who was able to do something at such an extraordinary scale because of all this accumulated experience. And so it was really heartening in a way. I mean, it showed the possibilities of this period of life, but also the importance of everything that led to it.
Well, I want to pivot here to questions from the audience, and I believe we have a microphone up here. And so if you think you have a question or something you'd like to ask Marc, start making your way up. And as we do that, let me just tee up one other question for you. I mentioned at the beginning Jim McGinley, who's with us here and able to answer questions about something called the Gen to Gen campaign, GEN, number 2, GEN. So tell us about Gen to Gen, and then we'll take questions.
Well, Gen to Gen began 2 years ago as a call to action, and our goal is to mobilize 1 million older people to stand up and show up for the next generation, to leave the world better than we found it. And one of the most thriving chapters, led by one of the most compelling leaders, is Gen to Gen Seattle, under Jim McGinley's great entrepreneurial leadership. So for those of you who are interested in that goal of creating a better future for future generations, there are obviously many ways to do it, but you should try to talk to Jim tonight, because he can tell you some of the work that's happening through Gen to Gen Seattle.
That's great. Are there any questions? And if anybody has a question but would rather ask it from where they sit, then make their way to the mic. Yeah. Oh, we've got one coming up to the mic. So. Come on up. Oh, okay. Go ahead.
I love this conversation. Thanks so much. You talk a lot about the young kids and the old people getting together. I'm curious if you thought about how to keep this momentum going through the lifespan to engage. I know people who are working in connecting careers and raising children and worrying about their parents are busy, but have you thought about ways to engage people across the lifespan?
Well, I think what we really need to do is to find ways to age integrate the various phases of life. So the workplace is a compelling example. I don't know how many of you saw The Intern, the movie with Robert De Niro, who mentors the Anne Hathaway character. I mentioned earlier we have a program at Encore, which is essentially a real-life version of it's the Encore Fellows program where people can work 1,000 hours in a nonprofit, get paid somewhere between $25,000 and $35,000, and try on the possibility of an Encore career. But one of the unanticipated benefits of the Encore Fellows program is it was age integrating these nonprofit workplaces, and so many of the Encore Fellows have ended up being the Robert De Niro to the Anne Hathaway playing, who's the executive director of the nonprofit, mentoring that. I think there's so much we can do in higher education. I was on KUOW earlier today, and we were talking about the University of Washington and how we could start integrating higher education. There are now a number of programs around the country. One started at Harvard, then at Stanford, now at the University of Minnesota, at Notre Dame, in which older people are going back to school for a year and having essentially a new stage of education, and in the process integrating those institutions. So I think there's so many things we need to do, not just at the older person, small child, preschool, senior center, but in daily life, in our neighborhoods, in higher education and schools, in the workplace. And there are examples of that happening all over the country.
That's great. Yes.
It seems to me that there's a lot of money going into convincing people that an aging society is bad. You get all these studies of Japan, Singapore, Ballard's getting boring, blah, blah. Do you think it's true that there's a huge input of financial effort, especially in business pages, to convince us of that? And who is doing that? Who wants a younger and younger and younger society?
Yeah, in fact, one of the reasons I wrote the book is there's a wealthy investor named Stanley Druckenmiller who, along with a great social entrepreneur, Jeff Canada, who's founder of the Harlem Children's Zone, went on a campus tour around the country to tell young people that there had been a generational war in the country and that young people had lost. And when pressed, Thomas Friedman wrote a adoring column about their campus tour, and they're both in their 60s. They'd been college friends at Bowdoin College in the 1970s. And they were there to save a few scraps from the table. And I have great admiration for both of them. And in fact, there are 60-somethings who are doing enormous amount of good things for kids. Druckenmiller had started something called Blue Meridian, which is a big investment fund for children's programs. Jeffrey Canada has, started the Harlem Children's Zone. So here are these 60-somethings who are telling young people that our country was going to hell in a handbasket, and that these gray wave of greedy geezers were, bankrupting posterity, and yet they themselves were doing a tremendous amount of good stuff for kids. And so I felt like we needed to hear the other side of this story, because we are hearing so much about the ways older people are damaging future generations, and there are ways that is happening, but there are so many things that are possible that some of them are underway, but there's so much more that we could do. So I feel like we need to balance that story out.
As we come up to the next question, I just want to insert something here about this work of flipping the narrative. So one of our friends and colleagues, a woman named Ai-jen Poo, who founded the National Domestic Workers Alliance, has been talking about this narrative of, as America grays and the critical mass of the population grows older in the baby boom generation, there's another dimension to all of what's going on here, which we haven't spoken about here particularly today, but she's very conscious of, organizing domestic workers. and that is a dimension of race and privilege. That the older generation, the generation that is aging is a much more white generation. The generation of caregivers, if you think about domestic care, domestic work, are women, often immigrant women of color, and that more broadly, the new America that is demographically being born as we speak is now literally majority children, babies of color, right? And there is a narrative there, in our politics for sure, in our culture, that says the equivalent of the generational war. We are headed toward a demographic war, right? And whites are becoming extinct, and this new wave of people of color coming. And iGen has tried to flip that narrative in just the way that you're suggesting, around this, and say, no. This is an incredible opportunity, right? That they're, in the same way that you talk about old people and young people today being the two loneliest groups of people, you have this kind of quote unquote silver tsunami that is largely white, and you have this rising generation of caregivers who are increasingly non-white. This is an incredible opportunity for the United States to build bridges of caring across generations, right? And across lines of race and identity. And that flipping of narrative, I think, is something that you're doing so effectively as well. And I just wanted to kind of name that, because this is a big part of what we've got to do here, is when you hear those stories and you think, why are the business pages always telling us that this is happening, this is bad? We have both an opportunity and responsibility to find ways to flip that. Sorry, come on next. Did you have a question?
Thanks. That's a great segue, because for me, thinking of my parents that are now retired, I have a mother who doesn't speak English fluently and a father who's a blue-collar worker. And so my curiosity is to find out, how can they be involved in this new work on their encore part of their lives, but they're not necessarily like university-educated folks. And so trying to find out what's their possible niche.
Great.
My own, I'm so glad that you asked that question, because my own experience in this area grew out of something called the Foster Grandparent Program, which was created during the War on Poverty. And it's a program that is for low-income older people, primarily women, and it's focused on bringing together those older people with children one-on-one. And the informal adage of the program is every dollar spent twice. And I remember going and interviewing Sergeant Shriver before he died about the foster grandparent program, and he said it worked, and it worked because it was human and because it was simple. It was simple, one-on-one, and it was human. It was all about relationship and connection. And to emphasize his point, he went into his desk and he fished out this black ashtray, which had all of the War on Poverty programs stenciled on them, and Head Start and foster grandparents are right next to each other. And I just love that this, testament to the War on Poverty, which had a big public health focus, was an ashtray. But I think in the end, what I'm most excited about is something that goes beyond education, goes beyond social class. That's both human and simple. What we know now is that as we get older, we have a much stronger impulse towards relationship. There's a whole body of psychological research called socio-emotional selectivity, which sounds very, abstruse, but in fact, it's that as we get closer to the end of life and have a sense that there's fewer years ahead than behind, we turn towards connection and relationship. It's like if somebody tells you that you've got a month left to live, you don't go out and start studying the oboe. You connect with other people. And it turns out that as we get older, even though our knees creak and, other things deteriorate, that the skills that are so important to a relationship, emotional regulation, empathy, actually blossom. So as we're drawn to connect, we actually get better at it. And then there is this tremendous impulse to connect down the generational chain. So I think that there are skills that we all have that are so essential to what the next generation needs. And in fact, that AI and robots and advances in technology are never going to replace. In a way, in one of the great ironies, I'm convinced that actually through technology taking on so many tasks, the tasks that will remain, the most human of tasks, are the things that older people are actually best at.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up? Your parent, who is for whom English is not the first language, what is her first language? Spanish. Okay, so I mean, I think part of an answer here too is in thinking about relationships and thinking about circles of relationship, is finding clubs and communities that you can already be, just by dint of your own background and heritage and identity, be connected to, right? And so there are pathways in. You don't have to be at the university. You don't have to have all of these other credentials, but there are pathways in for Spanish speakers to be doing this work in ways that are completely just about that identity. And I think about at our most recent Civic Saturday, there was an intergenerational group of Chinese Americans, some in their 60s and some who were high school students who'd both been participating in something called the Pathways Foundation, which started in the East Side and trying to get Chinese Americans and Asian Americans to be more involved in civic life, right? That's where they started, right? But now it's kind of bleeding out. Now they're partnering with Muslim American organizations and other groups, but they started with who they were, right? And that's always a kind of a corollary to starting on relationships. We've got time for one more question here.
I'm here tonight with about 14 of my friends and neighbors. We live together in a place called Timber Ridge, which is east of Seattle, about just at the edge of the mountains. And we're in a large senior community, just beginning to think about the meaning of the fact that we may well have a brand new middle school built on land just adjacent to our property. And what that would mean both for us and for them and for the schooling that will be going on. And so we're drawing some insights from you and your book and your thoughts. Do you have any comments for us, or maybe some encouragement for us?
Yeah. Well, our founding project as an organization is something called Experience Corps, which is essentially a mentoring corps of older people who work in teams in mostly elementary schools, not middle schools. And as the parent of a middle school student, I wish you well. In fact, I have a recruit for you. But I think that the way education has played out these days, there's just such a desperate need for caring adults in those schools. And what we found from Experience Corps, which was one of those rare programs that had extensive research done on it, is that the benefits to the children as anticipated were enormous, equivalent to a dramatic reduction in class size. But there have been such significant benefits to the older people. There's new research from Hopkins Medical School that shows that participation in a program like Experience Corps and the kind of things that you're thinking about actually reverses the preconditions to dementia as well as other things like diabetes. So there's just so much mutual benefit. But I think that the potential goes even deeper. And I am just reminded when you were talking of an experience I had in Philadelphia at the Taylor Elementary School. And we talked about loneliness earlier, and there's a woman named Martha Jones who was in the Experience Corps at Taylor Elementary School, and she told me about one day when she was not feeling well and she was depressed, and it was February in Philadelphia, and she didn't want to go into the school, and she pulled the covers back over, and she decided, and then she just kept thinking of the kids and how disappointed they were going to be, and so she, reversed, and she went back and forth, and finally she went downstairs, got dressed, went off to the school, and she was hanging her coat up, and it was one of these 1920s school buildings, and she described to me this feeling of these two little arms climbing up behind her. She said, "Somebody loves me," and I just think this is so natural, so human, and I think it could be a great adventure as well as really important for the kids. Yeah. So I hope you do it.
Thanks. Well,
let me just say in closing and kind of segueing out of that question and adventure that you and your 14 friends are about to embark on, that actually is a great exemplar of a thing that, again, in all our work civically and trying to activate civic engagement, we have this watchword, which is start a club or join a club. That thinking about trying to make any kind of change or getting involved in anything, if you think about it alone and in isolation, the mountain seems very high, right? You may be very inspired by some of the stories Marc has told, some of the innovations he's described. Maybe ideas have come to you of, hey, we could get that going in Ballard or in wherever, or in this town in North Bend or whatever it might be. But when you think about that yourself, that's a very daunting task. When you think about it with 2, 5, 10, 14 friends, and you don't have to live together necessarily, but 14 friends who form a club, form a circle, a commitment circle, a mutual aid circle, and say, hey, let's study this. Let's read this book and think more about ideas and examples of how people are doing this. And then let's take a map of the power and the opportunity in our community and think about what could we do to apply this book together, right? And that's rocket fuel for this kind of work. And I think one of the things that I've learned from watching Marc and watching Encore is that the whole ecosystem, whether they are Encore Fellows, Purpose Prize winners, people who Marc has touched in his work as a writer and author, none of these people operate alone. All of them operate in clubs, basically, right? Sometimes they're actually called clubs, sometimes they're just the functional equivalent of clubs, but they think about how do I form circles of people who we can hold each other through endeavors like this. And I think everything that Marc has done and everything that Encore.org is doing really exemplifies that. I just wanted to kind of emphasize that for your point, because you coming here with 14 people is like a big yay and a great example of this. And I also want to close just by saying, and we've talked about some of what is in the book, but a thing I really want to emphasize to you, and I think you've gotten a sense of it, you've gotten a sense of Marc's just deep humanity and humility and his wisdom and his kindness. And what's interesting and great about this book is not just the stories and the examples and the case studies and the resources at the back, including, you only touch on it in passing, kind of popular culture, like this whole compendium of movies and kind of popular TV shows that are themselves vehicles for this kind of gen-to-gen story here. But what's fundamentally awesome about this book is that it is written with beauty and with a spirit that is so welcoming and accessible that you feel like, I can do this. It doesn't matter who I know. It doesn't matter how much capital or social capital I have. This could be my story too, and it's a very welcoming book in that way. And I hope as you get your copy, you'll get a chance to chat more with Marc. But Marc, thank you so much for being with us, and please join me in thanking Marc Freedman for coming to Seattle. And thanks to Elliott Bay, too.